The wind that swept down across the Texas Panhandle in the late autumn of 1872 did not care if a man was a rancher, a drifter, or a Comanche scout. It cut through wool coats and buckskin alike, carrying the dry metallic scent of frost and the impending promise of a hard winter. It rattled the loose shingles of the main house at Rattlesnake Creek Ranch and whistled through the gaps in the bunkhouse walls. But nowhere was it felt more keenly, or defied more stubbornly, than in the small, detached structure known as the cook shack. Here, the air was thick with the smell of sourdough yeast, rendering beef tallow, and wood smoke. It was the warmest place on the ranch, a small kingdom ruled by a cast-iron stove that roared like a captured dragon. Yet social standing dictated it was also the lowest. To be the cook was to be essential but invisible, a pair of hands that provided sustenance but held no voice in the affairs of men. Lila Hart stood by the long pine table, her knuckles dusted white with flour. She was 24 years old, an age that the women in the settlement town of Tascosa would whisper was perilously close to spinsterhood. Lila did not mind the whispers, mostly because she rarely went to town to hear them. Her world was defined by the four walls of this kitchen, the rising of the sun, and the schedule of 20 hungry men who expected their biscuits hot and their coffee strong at 5 o'clock in the morning. She worked the dough with a rhythm that had become second nature, her palms pressing and folding. As she worked, a sound escaped her throat, soft and unconscious. It was not quite a song, for it had no words that anyone in the ranch house would recognize. It was a humming, low, oscillating melody that rose and fell like the wind bending the buffalo grass on the open plains. Her mother had left her very little when she passed a silver locket with a broken clasp, a Bible with a water-damaged cover, and this habit. Her mother used to hum it when the nights were dark and the coin jar was empty. She had told Lila once that it sounded like the earth breathing while it slept. Lila stopped abruptly, glancing toward the door. The habit was dangerous here. To be noticed was to invite trouble. She was a woman alone in a territory dominated by rough men and rougher laws. Her goal was simple and unyielding: keep her head down, cook the best meals in the county so they would not fire her, and save every single dollar until she had enough to buy a ticket to St. Louis, or perhaps even further east, somewhere with brick streets and libraries and no dust to coat her tongue. The door to the cook shack banged open, bringing a gust of frigid air that made the kerosene lantern flicker. "Close the door, June," Lila said without looking up, her voice steady. June, the scullery maid who was barely 18 and possessed a tongue sharper than a skinning knife, kicked the door shut with her heel. She was carrying a bucket of water that sloshed over the rim onto the dirt floor. "You are humming again," June said, setting the bucket down with a groan. "Sounds spooky, like a ghost stuck in a chimney." "It passes the time," Lila replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did you see Mr. Pike? Did he say how many for supper?" "Pike is in a foul mood," June said, moving to the stove to warm her hands. "The whole territory is in a foul mood. I heard the boys talking by the corral. They say Silas Crow is back." Lila felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck that had nothing to do with the draft. Silas Crow. The name carried a weight that made the air in the kitchen feel suddenly heavier. He was a man who called himself a bounty hunter, but that was a polite term for a butcher who worked for the highest bidder. In this part of the Panhandle, the highest bidder was always Harlan Pike, the owner of Rattlesnake Creek Ranch. "What is Crow doing here?" Lila asked, trying to keep her tone indifferent as she began to cut the biscuits with a tin cup. "Trouble," June whispered, her eyes wide with the thrill of bad news. "Big trouble. You know that government shipment. The annuity for the reservation, the one with the blankets and the beef money." Lila nodded. It was the talk of the entire autumn. The treaty promised supplies to the Comanche bands that had agreed to stay within the reservation lines to the north. It was a fragile peace, held together by paper and promises. "Gone," June said, snapping her fingers. "Vanished off the wagon trail 2 days ago. The driver was found with an arrow in his back. They are saying it was a raiding party. Renegades." Lila paused, the tin cup hovering over the dough. An arrow, that seems convenient. Don't you start with your soft-headed thinking, June scolded, though she lowered her voice. The town is in an uproar. Agent Barker came riding in with Crow an hour ago. They are saying the Comanches broke the treaty. They stole the money meant to feed their own just to buy rifles. That is what Pike says. Lila returned to cutting the biscuits. She knew enough about the world to know that truth was often the first thing to be buried out here, usually in a shallow grave. She remembered the two men she'd seen 3 nights ago, lurking near the back of the supply shed. They did not look like Comanches. They looked like white men wearing canvas dusters, smelling of cheap whiskey and wet wool. Their boots caked in the distinctive red mud of the riverbank, the same riverbank where the annuity wagons supposedly crossed. But she was just a cook. Who would listen to her over the word of Harlan Pike and a government agent? It will mean fighting, Lila said softly. It means overtime for us, June complained. Pike wants a big dinner. He and Barker and Crow are discussing strategy. That means steaks, Lila, the good cuts, and dried apple pie. Lila sighed. Her quiet evening of mending her apron was gone. She moved to the pantry, her mind racing. If the town believed the Comanche had stolen the annuity, the anger would boil over into violence, mob violence. It did not matter if it was true. In the Panhandle, an accusation was often as good as a verdict. Miles away, under the cover of the deepening twilight, the subject of the town's hatred moved through the brush with the silence of a shadow. Cade was young, perhaps 22 or 23, though his face held the stillness of a man who had seen 3 lifetimes of war. He was Comanche, a scout, and a messenger for his band, which was currently camped in a canyon 2 days' ride to the north. He wore a mixture of traditional buckskin and trade cloth items, a sturdy wool shirt that had seen better days, and leggings that protected him from the mesquite thorns. He was not raiding. He was starving. The annuity shipment had never arrived. His people were waiting for the flour and the beef that had been promised in exchange for their land, in exchange for their freedom to roam. The winter was coming fast, and the lodgepoles were bare of meat. The elders had sent him and 2 others to find out why the wagons had stopped. What Cade had found was not a raiding party, but tracks. Wagon wheels that turned off the main road and headed not toward the reservation, but south, toward the hidden canyons on the edge of the sprawling land claimed by the cattle barons. He had found the broken shaft of an arrow planted in a dead driver, a crude imitation. The fletching tied wrong. The wood not seasoned the way a Comanche arrow maker would season it. It was a lie carved in wood and flesh. He pulled his horse, a roan mare with intelligent eyes and ribs that showed too clearly through her winter coat, to a halt behind a ridge of limestone. Below him lay Rattlesnake Creek Ranch. The windows of the main house glowed with golden light, spilling out onto the porch where men stood smoking cigars. Cade watched them. He knew who they were. He knew the heavy, bull-like shape of Harlan Pike. He recognized the lean, predatory stance of Silas Crow. Crow was a man who collected scalps for money, a man who had hunted Cade's kin for sport long before there was a bounty on them. Cade's stomach twisted with hunger, a sharp, gnawing pain that he had learned to ignore. He could not go down there. It was suicide. The air around the ranch smelled of danger as strongly as it smelled of cattle. But he also smelled something else. Food. Bread baking. The wind carried the scent up the ridge. A cruel temptation. He patted the mare's neck. Patience, he whispered in his own tongue. We watch. We listen. He needed to know where the wagons had really gone. If he went back to his people with only suspicion, the young men would ride out to fight, and they would be slaughtered by the superior numbers of the settlers and the soldiers. He needed proof. He dismounted, leading the mare down a narrow game trail that wound behind the ranch, keeping to the blind spots of the guards. He moved like smoke, placing his feet with a deliberation that left no sound. He was not looking for a fight. He was looking for the truth, and perhaps, if the spirits were kind, a scrap of food that might have been discarded. He did not know that the wind that carried the scent of bread to him also carried something else, a faint, Rhythmic sound from the small shack behind the main house, a sound that reminded him of things he thought he had lost forever. Back in the cook shack, the heat was rising. The dinner rush was a chaotic symphony of clattering pans and sizzling grease. Lila moved with the efficiency of a general on a battlefield. "June, watch the gravy. Do not let it lump," Lila commanded, flipping 3 steaks on the cast-iron griddle. The meat hissed and spat, filling the room with savory smoke. The door opened again, and this time it was not a scullery maid. It was Silas Crow. He filled the doorway, a tall man in a long duster coat that looked like it had been stained with oil and blood. He wore his gun belt low, the leather holster tied down to his thigh. His face was a map of hard living, with a scar running through his left eyebrow that gave him a permanent expression of skepticism. The kitchen went silent. Even the fire seemed to quiet down. "Smells good in here," Crow said. His voice was like gravel grinding under a boot heel. He did not look at June. He looked directly at Lila. Lila did not flinch, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her eyes on the steaks. "Supper is at 6 o'clock. Mr. Crow, we are not ready to serve." Crow stepped into the room. He walked with a slight limp, the legacy of a bullet from a Kiowa rifle years ago. He stopped at the table, picking up a raw biscuit and inspecting it. "Pike wants me to check the perimeter," Crow said, crushing the dough in his fist. "Says he heard noises near the creek. Have you girls seen anything red?" June squeaked and shook her head violently. "No, sir, nothing." Crow's eyes, pale and watery blue, drilled into Lila. "And you, Miss Hart, you got eyes. You see any savages creeping around your woodpile?" Lila turned the steak one last time and wiped her hands on her apron. She faced him then. "I see a lot of things. Mr. Crow, mostly I see hungry men and firewood that needs chopping. I have not seen any Comanches. I hear they are starving up north because their supplies never came." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Crow dropped the ruined biscuit onto the clean floor. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "You have a bleeding heart, Miss Hart," he said softly. "Careful. That kind of heart gets a person killed out here. The savages took that money. And when I find the ones who did it, I am going to hang them from the cottonwood tree by the river. You keep your eyes open. If you see anything, and do not tell me." He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but perfectly clear. He turned and walked out, his spurs jingling with a discordant sound. Lila let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. Her hands were trembling. She clenched them into fists until the shaking stopped. "Lila," June whispered, terrified. "Why did you say that about the supplies?" "Because it is the truth," Lila said, though she felt a cold pit of fear in her stomach. She knelt down and picked up the crushed dough from the floor, throwing it into the slop bucket. "Get the platter. June, Mr. Pike is waiting." The dinner was served. Lila stayed in the kitchen, refusing to go into the main dining room to serve the men. She let June take the platters out. She could hear the voices drifting from the main house loud, boisterous, angry. They were drinking whiskey now, and the talk was turning violent. They were talking about forming a posse. They were talking about riding out at dawn to teach a lesson to any Comanche they found off the reservation. Lila washed the dishes in the tin basin, the hot water turning her skin pink. She scrubbed the cast-iron pans until her arms ached. By the time the last dish was dried and put away, it was past 9 o'clock. June had gone to her cot in the attic above the pantry. Exhausted, Lila was alone. She extinguished the main lanterns, leaving only the glow from the stove's open damper and a single candle on the work table. The kitchen settled into its nightly noises, the cooling metal ticking, the wind buffeting the walls. She went to the loose floorboard under the dry sink and pried it up with a spoon. There, nestled in the dirt, was a glass jar. She pulled it out and unscrewed the lid. Inside was a roll of bills and a handful of coins. Her escape fund. It had taken her 4 years to save $42. It was not enough. Not nearly enough. She counted it again, just to feel the paper, then put it back. $42 was freedom, but it was miles away. She stood up and walked to the window. The glass was cold against her forehead. Outside, the night was a wall of black. The wind was howling louder now, a lonely, desolate sound that made the ranch feel like a tiny raft in the middle of a dark ocean. She felt the old urge rising in her chest, the need to comfort herself, the need to make a sound that was hers alone, something to push back against the silence and the fear of the violent men who ran this world. She went back to the work table. She still had to prepare the sourdough starter for the morning. She sprinkled flour onto the board. As her hands began the familiar motion of kneading the starter, the sound started again. It was a low, mournful tune, dipping and rising. It was the sound of the wind moving through long grass. It was a lullaby for a child who had no bed. Lila closed her eyes, swaying slightly as she worked. She hummed to forget Silas Crow's dead eyes. She hummed to forget the cold. She hummed to forget that she was 24 and alone in a kitchen that did not belong to her. She did not know that outside, just beyond the frost-rimmed glass of the back window, the darkness had shifted. Cade had tied the mare in a copse of scrub oak a quarter of a mile back. He had moved in on foot, drawn by the smell of the refuse pile where the cooks often threw the scraps. It was humiliating for a warrior to scavenge like a coyote, but his mission was more important than his pride. He had found a stale heel of bread and a beef bone with some meat still clinging to it. He should have turned back then. He should have melted back into the night, but he had heard it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind. The wind in the canyon sometimes played games, sounding like voices or crying babies. But this was distinct. It was melodic. He crept closer to the small building detached from the main house. The light inside was dim, a warm orange square against the black night. He moved along the wall, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He reached the corner and peered around. There was a window. Inside, he saw a woman. She was not like the women he usually saw on the ranches, hard-faced wives of settlers who looked at him with hate, or fancy women in town who looked through him. She looked tired. She was wearing a plain gray dress and a white apron covered in flour. Her hair was pulling loose from its pins. She was working dough, her hands moving with a grace that mesmerized him. But it was the sound that froze him in his tracks. She was humming. Cade stopped breathing. The melody. It was not a church hymn. It was not a saloon song. It twisted and turned in a way that was familiar. It hit him in the chest like a physical blow. It sounded like the songs his grandmother used to sing when she scraped hides by the fire, before the pox took her, before the soldiers came, before the world broke apart. It was the sound of the land. He stood there, a young Comanche warrior with a knife at his belt and a hunger in his belly, transfixed by a white cook in a warm kitchen. He knew he should leave. The men in the big house were talking about killing him. Silas Crow was somewhere nearby. Every second he stayed was a gamble with his life, but he could not move. The song held him. It was a bridge across the darkness, a strange, impossible connection in a night filled with enemies. He stepped away from the wall, moving into the space where the light from the window spilled onto the ground. He was exposed now. If she looked up, she would see him. If a guard walked by, he would be shot. Inside the kitchen. Lila paused. The hairs on her arms stood up. The humming died in her throat. She felt eyes on her. Not the predatory eyes of Crow, but something else. Something intense and silent. She opened her eyes and looked toward the window. The wind howled, rattling the pane. The shadow outside stood absolutely still. Lila stood frozen by the pine table, her flour-dusted hands hovering over the sourdough starter. The pane of glass that separated her from the night was thin, distorted by age and the cold, but the figure standing on the other side was unmistakably human. He was not a trick of the lantern light, nor was he a phantom conjured by her exhaustion. He was a silhouette cut from the fabric of the dark, motionless against the backdrop of the howling wind. For a heartbeat, fear seized her. A woman alone in a cook shack, separated from the main house by 50 yards of wind-scoured earth, was a woman vulnerable. Her mind flashed to the stories the ranch hands told around the bunkhouse stove tales of drifters with hollow eyes and desperate intentions. But the figure did not move to break the glass. He did not pound on the frame or try the latch. He simply stood there, his head cocked slightly to the side, as if he were listening to a sound that no one else could hear. Outside. Cade felt the cold seep through his buckskin leggings, but he barely registered the chill. The song had stopped the moment she saw him, yet the melody continued to vibrate in his chest. It was a song from the old days, a song the women of the Antelope Band used to sing while grinding mesquite beans. It was a song of the earth, of the way the grass bowed to the storm. To hear it coming from the throat of a white woman in a settler's kitchen was like finding a buffalo grazing on a cloud. It was impossible, and yet it was true. He stepped closer. He should have run. Every instinct he possessed as a scout screamed at him to vanish into the scrub oak before the dogs caught his scent. Silas Crow and his men were out there, hunting shadows, and Cade was the darkest shadow of all. But the pull of that familiar rhythm was stronger than his survival instinct. It was a tether to a life that had been stolen from him by treaties and rifles. Lila watched him approach the window. The light from the lantern caught the side of his face. He was young, perhaps her own age, with high cheekbones and skin the color of polished copper. His hair was long and dark, though cut shorter on the sides than the drawings in the newspapers depicted. He wore no war paint, only the dust of the trail and the weariness of a man who had not slept in days. His eyes, dark and intelligent, locked onto hers. There was no malice in them. There was only a profound, starving curiosity. He raised a hand, not to strike, but to touch the glass. His fingers brushed the frost. Lila did not scream. She did not reach for the heavy cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall. A strange calm settled over her, born of the surreal nature of the moment. The wind battered the shack, making the wooden walls groan, but inside, the silence between them was absolute. Then, he spoke. The voice was muffled by the glass and the wind, but the words were English, accented with a cadence she had never heard before. It was soft, like dry leaves skittering over stone. "That song," he said, the words barely penetrating the barrier. "It is for the river." Lila stared at him, her breath hitching in her throat. The words bypassed her logic and struck a chord deep in her memory. Her mother, feverish and thin, sitting on the edge of a wagon bed, humming that same tune while the prairie stretched out endlessly around them. Her mother had never called it a river song. She had called it something else, a word Lila had not thought of in 10 years, a word she had assumed was just nonsense baby talk. "It is puha," Lila whispered. The word left her lips before she could stop it. It was unconscious, a reflex buried under layers of time. She did not know what it meant. To her, puha was just a sound that meant safety, a sound that meant sleep. On the other side of the glass, Cade stiffened as if he had been struck. The word hung in the air between them. Puha, power, medicine, spirit. It was a sacred word in his tongue, spoken by a woman who looked like she belonged to the world of fences and stone houses. He looked at her with a new intensity, searching her face for some sign of his own people, but he saw only blue eyes and pale skin. Yet she knew the word. She knew the song. The moment stretched, fragile and impossible, until the sound of hoofbeats shattered it. The rumble was distant at first, then rapidly grew to a thunderous cadence approaching from the north road. Men were riding hard, shouting over the wind. The spell broke. Cade's expression shifted instantly from wonder to the hard, sharp look of a hunted animal. He pulled away from the window, his head snapping toward the sound. He looked back at Lila one last time. It was a look of recognition, an acknowledgement that they shared a secret in a world that would destroy them both for it. He reached into the pouch at his belt. He did not have time to speak again. He placed something on the narrow wooden ledge of the windowsill, a small object that clicked softly against the wood. Then he was gone. He did not run. He simply dissolved into the darkness, moving with a fluidity that made Lila wonder if he had ever been there at all. Lila stood paralyzed for a second, her heart hammering against her ribs. The hoofbeats were louder now, accompanied by the distinct crack of a pistol shot fired into the air, a signal. She rushed to the door. She had to know. She cracked it open just an inch. The wind tore at her apron. On the window ledge, bathed in the faint spill of light, sat a small object. She snatched it up and slammed the door, engaging the heavy iron bolt just as the riders thundered into the yard between the main house and the barn. She leaned her back against the door, breathing hard. She opened her hand. It was a piece of bone, perhaps from a deer or a buffalo, carved into a flat, smooth disc. Etched into the surface was a simple design, a line curving like a river, and above it, a single eye. It was crude, but elegant, warm from his pocket. It felt heavy in her palm, heavier than a gold coin. "Open up. Open the damn door." The shout came from the yard, followed by the heavy thud of boots hitting the dirt. It was Silas Crow. Lila shoved the bone disc into the pocket of her apron, her fingers trembling. She smoothed her hair, took a deep breath, and forced her face into a mask of annoyed servitude. She waited for the pounding on the door before she opened it. Silas Crow stood there, a torch in one hand and a drawn Colt revolver in the other. Behind him, two other men sat on restless horses, their rifles drawn. The torchlight cast long, dancing shadows across Crow's face, making the scar over his eye look like a fresh wound. "Mr. Crow," Lila said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "You will wake the dead with that racket." Crow pushed past her without an invitation, stepping into the warmth of the kitchen. He swept the torch around, illuminating the corners, the pantry door, the space beneath the table. He looked wild, his eyes feverish with the hunt. "We cut his sign 2 miles back," Crow snarled, holstering his pistol but keeping his hand near the grip. "A buck, riding a roan mare. He doubled back this way. I know he did." He turned on Lila, looming over her. The smell of horse sweat, stale whiskey, and gun oil rolled off him in waves. "Who was here? Girl, I saw a light. I saw a shadow moving by the window." Lila did not blink. She gripped the fabric of her apron, feeling the hard edge of the bone disc through the cloth. "I was here, Mr. Crow. I am working on the dough for tomorrow. I moved by the window to check the weather. The wind is fierce tonight." Crow stared at her, his eyes narrowing. He stepped closer, invading her space until she was forced to lean back against the table. "Do not lie to me. Cook, I know the smell of an Indian. He was close. Did he come in here? Did he threaten you?" "No one has been here," Lila said, and she managed to inject a note of indignation into her voice. "And if you think a Comanche scout would knock on the door of the cook shack to ask for a biscuit, you give them less credit than they deserve. I have been alone since June and went to sleep." Crow held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment. He was looking for a flicker of deceit, a tremor of fear that did not belong. Lila gave him nothing but the weary annoyance of a woman interrupted at her work. "Finally!" Crow spat on the floor, narrowly missing her shoe. "Check the barn," he shouted to the men outside. "And check the root cellar. If he is on this ranch, I want his scalp before morning." He turned back to Lila. "If I find out you are hiding something, Hart, Pike will hear of it, and Pike does not like traitors." "I am hiding nothing but my recipes," Lila retorted. "And I would thank you not to spit in my kitchen." Crow sneered, turned on his heel, and marched out into the night. The door slammed shut, but the latch did not catch. The wind blew it open again, banging it against the wall. Lila rushed to the door and bolted it. She listened as the horses moved off toward the barn, the men shouting to one another. They were moving away. She sagged against the wood, her legs suddenly turning to water. She slid down until she was sitting on the cold floor, the flour on her hands leaving white streaks on her gray dress. She pulled the bone disc from her pocket. She held it up to the lantern light. The eye stared back at her. "I saw you," it seemed to say. "I heard you." She knew what this was. It was not just a trinket. It was evidence. If Crow had found this in her pocket, he would have dragged her out into the yard and accused her of aiding a fugitive. The town of Tascosa was on a hair trigger. The theft of the annuity had turned every heart hard. To be associated with a Comanche now was a sentence of social death, if not physical violence. She stood up on shaky legs and went to the small shelf where she kept her few personal belongings. She took down her mother's old, water-stained recipe book. It was the only thing of value she owned. A book filled with instructions on how to make bread rise in humid weather and how to stretch a pound of beef to feed 10 men. She opened the book to the back cover, where the binding had come loose. Carefully, she slid the bone disc into the gap between the spine and the cover. It fit perfectly, hidden away beneath the recipes for apple brown Betty and corn pone. She had a secret now, a dangerous, jagged secret that felt heavy in the room. The next morning, the ranch was buzzing like a kicked hive. Lila was up at 4, as usual. But the atmosphere in the cook shack had changed. June came down from the loft with wide eyes, already full of gossip she had gleaned from the early risers. "They say they found tracks near the woodpile," June whispered as she measured out the coffee. "Crow says it was a scout for a raiding party. He says they are coming to burn us out." Lila kneaded the dough with more force than necessary. "Crow says a lot of things to justify his paycheck," she said. "But the boys are scared." "Lila," June insisted, "wait until you go to the well. There is a poster up in town already. Harlan Pike put up a reward, $500 for the head of the thief, and $50 just for information." $50. That was more than Lila made in 6 months. It was enough to buy a ticket to anywhere. It was enough to buy a new life. And all she had to do was tell them that a young man with sad eyes had stood at her window and whispered about a river song. She felt the weight of the book on the shelf behind her. Later that morning, when the sun was high and the wind had died down to a manageable breeze, Lila went to the pump to draw water for the noon meal. The ranch yard was busy. Men were cleaning rifles on the porch of the bunkhouse. The talk was loud and angry. "I saw him," one of the hands, a man named Miller, was saying. "I swear I saw him near the cook shack last night, just a shadow, but he moved like a snake." "Why was he in the kitchen?" another man asked, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Looking for food." "Maybe," Miller said, his eyes drifting toward Lila as she worked the pump handle. "Or maybe he was looking for something else. You know how they are. They watch, they wait." Lila felt their eyes on her back. It was a physical sensation, like ants crawling on her skin. They were not accusing her. Not yet. But the seed had been planted. He was near the kitchen. Why the kitchen? She filled her buckets and turned to walk back. She kept her head high, her face impassive. She was Lila Hart, the cook. She was invisible. She had to remain invisible. But as she walked, the rhythm of her humming threatened to rise in her throat again. She clamped her mouth shut. That song was dangerous now. It was no longer her comfort. It was a connection to the enemy. She reached the safety of the cook shack and kicked the door shut behind her. She looked at the recipe book on the shelf. The world had shifted overnight. The kitchen, once her sanctuary, her warm prison, had become a trap. And the open prairie, with its biting wind and its hidden canyons, suddenly felt like the only place where the truth might still be alive. She touched her apron pocket, imagining the bone was still there. Puha, she had said. Medicine? She went back to the stove. The fire needed wood. The men needed meat. And Lila Hart needed to learn how to keep a secret that could burn the whole territory to the ground. Over the next 3 days, the presence of the Comanche scout became a ghost story told in wood and water. He did not show his face. The window pane remained dark, and the horizon was empty of riders save for the ranch hands patrolling the fence line. Yet, Lila knew he was there. The evidence of his proximity was written in the subtle alterations of her daily labor, small kindnesses that felt louder than any shout. It began with the woodpile. For 2 years, Lila had fought a losing battle with the cottonwood logs provided for the stove. They were often green, hissing with sap that choked the flue and made the biscuits rise unevenly. But on Tuesday morning, she went out to the stack and found a neat pyramid of seasoned oak, dry as bone and split into perfect lengths for her firebox. It was wood that burned hot and clean, the kind that made a cook's life bearable. On Wednesday, The heavy water barrel by the door, which she usually had to drag June out of bed to help refill from the pump, was brimming to the rim before the sun had even crested the horizon. The water was clear, free of the silt that often clogged the bottom when the hands filled it carelessly. On Thursday, the back door latch, which had been broken since the previous winter and required a heavy rock to keep it shut against the north wind, was fixed. A piece of sturdy rawhide had been worked into the mechanism, tied with a knot so complex and secure it looked like a piece of art. Lila traced the leather with her thumb. It was not charity. It was communication. It was a man saying, "I am here. I am watching. I am useful." But with the silent help came the noise of the world. The kitchen, once her sanctuary of anonymity, had become a theater of suspicion. June, who had the instincts of a prairie dog sensing a storm, had picked up on the tension. "You are humming again," June said that afternoon, slapping a wet rag onto the table to wipe down the flour. Her voice was pitched high, designed to carry. "And looking out the window, Miller says he saw tracks by the creek again. Moccasin tracks." Lila did not look up from the potatoes she was peeling. "Miller sees tracks in his soup if he drinks enough whiskey." "June?" "It is not just Miller," June pressed, leaning in, her eyes gleaming with the cruelty of the bored and powerless. "The boys are talking. They say it is funny how the wood gets chopped by itself. They say maybe you have a spirit helper, or maybe you are humming a calling song, calling a savage to come and cut our throats while we sleep." Lila set the knife down. The blade made a sharp thack against the wood. "That is enough." "Is it?" June sneered. "They are calling you the Comanche bride down at the bunkhouse. Lila, they say you are putting hexes in the stew." The words stung, not because they were true, but because they stripped away the one defense Lila had: her invisibility. She had spent years making herself colorless, a part of the furniture, just to survive the predatory gaze of men like Pike and Crow. Now, she was a focal point. She was a joke. And out here, a joke could turn into a tragedy very quickly. That night, the anger simmered in her chest, hotter than the stove. She waited until June was asleep, snoring softly in the loft. The wind was up again, masking the sounds of the night. Lila threw a heavy wool shawl over her shoulders and opened the back door. She did not hum. She walked out into the cold, past the repaired wood pile, to the edge of the light thrown by the kitchen window. She stood by the rain barrel, her breath pluming in the air. "I know you are there," she said. She spoke quietly, to the darkness, refusing to shout. "Stop fixing the door. Stop hauling the water. You are making them look at me." For a long moment, there was only the wind. Then, from the deep shadow of the smokehouse, a figure detached itself. Cade stepped into the faint gray light of the moon. He looked thinner than he had 3 nights ago. The hollows under his cheekbones were more pronounced, but his posture was unbroken. He stood with the stillness of a hawk on a fence post. "They look at you, but they do not see you," Cade said. His voice was low, carrying that same strange, rhythmic accent. "They see a servant. They see a joke. They do not see the woman who carries the river song. They see a woman who is going to get fired, or worse," Lila snapped, hugging the shawl tighter. "June is talking. The men are talking. They say I am calling you." "Are you?" Cade asked. It was not a flirtation. It was a direct question, stripped of irony. Lila faltered. Was she every time she hummed now? She thought of the bone disc hidden in her recipe book. She thought of the eyes that had looked at her with recognition. "I am trying to survive," she said firmly. "And you should be running." "There is a price on your head. $500. Do you know what men like Crow will do for $500? They will peel the skin from you while you are still breathing." Cade took a step closer. He was not intimidated by the threat of violence. He lived in a world defined by it. "I cannot run. Not yet. If I run, the lie becomes the truth." "What lie?" "The lie that my people took the annuity," Cade said. "Pike and the agent. Barker. They say we stole the wagons. They say we killed the driver. If I go back to the reservation without proof that this is false, the soldiers will come. They will use it as an excuse to break the treaty. They will kill the women and the old ones. Lila shivered. Everyone says it was a raiding party. They found arrows. Crow is a man who knows how to plant an arrow. Cade said bitterly. Listen to me. The wagons never crossed the river. They turned south. I tracked them to the edge of the Canyonlands. But the trail was swept away by the wind. I need to know where they went. I need to know who signed the papers saying they arrived. Why tell me? Lila asked. I am just the cook. Because you see, Cade said. You saw men before the theft. I saw it in your face when Crow asked you. You know something. Lila looked away, toward the dark outline of the main house. The memories she had suppressed came rushing back, sharp and clear. 3 nights before the news came, she whispered. Before the wagons were supposed to be here, I was out back, dumping the slop bucket. I saw 2 men by the supply shed. They were not ranch hands. They wore long dusters, new ones. They smelled of expensive whiskey and damp earth. Red earth, Cade asked. Lila nodded slowly. Yes, red mud on their boots. The kind you find down by the Rojo River crossing, 20 miles south, but it has not rained here in weeks. The wagons were supposed to cross at the North Ford, Cade said, a grim satisfaction in his tone. If they had red mud, they were waiting at the South Crossing. They took the supplies before they ever got near the reservation. It was Pike, Lila realized, the horror of it settling in. He is stealing the government money meant for your people, and Crow is here to make sure no one asks questions. He needs a villain, Cade said. He needs a savage to blame so the town gets angry. An angry town does not look at the books. An angry town buys ropes and guns. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the wood smoke and sage on his skin. I need to see the ledger. Lila, Pike keeps a book of everything that comes onto this ranch, even the stolen things. He is a greedy man, and greedy men count every coin. The ledger is in his office, Lila said, her heart racing. In the main house, he keeps the key on his watch chain. I can open a lock without a key, Cade said, but I cannot walk into the main house. The dogs will smell me. The guards will see me. But the cook goes everywhere. Lila stared at him. He was asking her to commit a crime. He was asking her to risk her job, her reputation, and her life. And for what? For a stranger, for a people she had been taught to fear. But then she thought of June's sneer. She thought of Silas Crow spitting on her clean floor. She thought of the way Pike looked at her, as if she were a piece of livestock that had ceased to be useful. They treat me like I am nothing, Lila said, her voice hardening. Like I am just a pair of hands. Then use your hands to break their lie, Cade said. I do not ask for your heart, Lila Hart. I do not ask for your pity. We make a trade. You help me find the truth to save my people. I will help you. I help you strike back at the men who make you small. It was a cold bargain, born of necessity. There was no romance in it, only the sharp edge of mutual survival. And yet, looking at him, Lila felt a pull she could not name. It was respect. He was the first man in 10 years who had looked at her and asked for her strength, not her servitude. Tonight, she said, Pike is going into town to meet the judge. Crow will go with him. The guards will be in the bunkhouse playing cards because of the cold. Tonight, Cade agreed. The storm broke 2 hours later. A sudden, violent squall typical of the Panhandle. Rain lashed the roof of the main house like handfuls of gravel. Thunder rolled across the plains, shaking the ground. Lila moved through the shadows of the covered breezeway that connected the kitchen to the main house. She carried a basket of linens, a flimsy prop, but her heart was beating so hard she felt sure it would give her away. She reached the side door of the main house. It was unlocked. Pike was arrogant. He believed his reputation was locked enough. She slipped inside. The house smelled of lemon oil, stale cigar smoke, and old money. It was quiet. She moved down the hallway, her felt-soled shoes silent on the polished floor. The office was at the end of the hall. She reached the heavy oak door and tried the handle. Locked. She glanced behind her. The hallway was empty. A flash of lightning illuminated the portrait of Pike's father on the wall, his eyes seeming to judge her. A soft tap on the window at the end of the hall made her jump. She hurried to it. Outside, clinging to the trellis like a vine, was Cade. She unlatched the window. He slid inside, shaking the rain from his hair. He brought the scent of the storm in with him, wild and electric. "The door's locked," she whispered. Cade moved to the office door. He knelt down, pulling a thin piece of wire from his belt. He worked with a focus that was terrifying in its precision. In 10 seconds, the lock clicked. They slipped inside. The office was a monument to Harlan Pike's ego. A massive mahogany desk dominated the room, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books that looked like they had never been opened. "The desk," Cade whispered. "Check the drawers." Lila went behind the desk. Her hands were shaking. She opened the top drawer. Pistols. A bottle of brandy. She opened the second. Papers, land deeds, cattle tallies. "Nothing here," she hissed. Cade was scanning the bookshelves. A man like Pike does not hide his sins in a desk. He hides them where he thinks no one is smart enough to look. He ran his hand along the rows of books. He stopped at a thick volume titled History of the Roman Empire. He pulled it. It did not move, but a small section of the paneling beside the shelf clicked open. A hidden compartment. Lila gasped. "How did you know?" "I know men who build walls," Cade said. "They always leave a loose stone." He reached into the compartment and pulled out a black ledger. It was smaller than the others, battered and worn. He opened it on the desk, flipping through the pages. "Here," he pointed, his finger tracing a line of ink. "October 14th. Delivery received. 300 blankets. 50 barrels of flour. 40 crates of rifles. Received from the agent. Stored at Cañon del Muerto." Cañon del Muerto. Lila read over his shoulder. "That is the Dead Man's Canyon. It is 20 miles west, in the Badlands. And here," Cade tapped another entry. "Payment to S. Crow, $1,000. For disposal of transport." "He paid Crow to kill the driver," Lila whispered. The cruelty of it was black and stark on the page. Suddenly, the front door of the house slammed open. Voices boomed in the hallway. "I forgot the deed. Damn it, wait here. Barker." It was Pike. He was back early. Lila froze, her blood turning to ice. They were trapped. The footsteps were heavy, coming straight down the hall. "Put it back," Lila hissed. "No," Cade said, his eyes hard. "We need this." He shoved the ledger into his shirt. "He will see us." Cade looked around. The room had one window, overlooking the porch roof, but Pike was already at the door. The handle turned. Cade grabbed Lila's arm and pulled her behind the heavy velvet curtains just as the door swung open. Pike stomped into the room. He was muttering to himself, smelling of rain and brandy. He walked to the desk. He paused. Lila held her breath. Had they closed the drawer? Had they left wet footprints? Pike grunted. He opened the top drawer, rummaged for a moment, and pulled out a document. Then, he stopped. He sniffed the air. "Wet dog," Pike muttered. Or, he turned slowly, looking around the room. His eyes landed on the curtains. Lila squeezed her eyes shut. She felt Cade's body tensed beside her. A coiled spring ready to snap. He had a knife in his hand. If Pike opened the curtain, Cade would kill him. Lila knew this with absolute certainty. And then they would both hang. Pike took a step toward the curtains. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen, the main house kitchen. Down the hall, a pot falling, or a cat. Pike jumped. What the hell? He turned and marched out of the room, shouting, "Who is in there, Mrs. Leary?" The moment he was gone, Cade threw open the window. The wind howled in, covering the noise. "Go," he ordered, helping Lila over the sill onto the wet shingles of the porch roof. "Slide down the trellis, run to the cook shack. Do not look back." "What about you?" Lila asked, clinging to the wet wood. "I will lead them away," Cade said. He looked at her, rain streaming down his face. "You did well, Lila Hart." He vaulted over the railing. dropping into the mud below with a heavy thud that was deliberately loud. He shouted something in Comanche, a war cry that pierced the storm. "Hey!" Pike shouted from inside. "He's outside, Crow. The Indian is outside." Gunshots erupted immediately. The night exploded into chaos. Lila slid down the trellis, tearing her dress, scraping her palms raw. She hit the ground and ran. She ran through the mud, slipping and sliding, her heart pounding in her ears like a drum. She reached the cook shack and threw herself inside, bolting the door. She collapsed against it, gasping for air, her chest burning. Outside, the shouting moved away from the house, toward the creek, chasing the ghost she had just unleashed. Lila crawled to the stove and fed wood into the fire with trembling hands. She needed to look like she had been here all along. She needed to be the cook. She sat on her stool, wrapping her arms around herself. She was shaking violently, but amidst the fear, there was something else, a fierce, burning pride. She had walked into the lion's den. She had seen the truth. She began to hum, softly at first, then stronger. It was the only way to calm her racing heart. She hummed the river song, but this time, she wasn't humming to hide. She was humming to guide him, wherever he was, running through the rain with a bullet in his shoulder or a ledger in his shirt. She hoped he could feel it. It was her compass in the dark. She was no longer just a cook. She was a conspirator. And for the first time in her life, the song did not feel lonely. The wind on the high plains did not simply blow. It scoured. It was a physical weight, a living thing with teeth made of grit and ice that chewed at the leather of the saddle and the skin of the face. Lila Hart kept her head down, her scarf wrapped tight across her nose and mouth, trusting the horse beneath her to follow the roan mare ahead. They had ridden out under the cover of the storm's tail, stealing a sturdy quarter horse from the paddock while the ranch was still in chaos from Cade's diversion. Now, they were miles away from the safety of the kitchen, deep in the broken, jagged country known as the Badlands. The ledger Cade had stolen sat heavy in his saddlebag, a book of sins that pointed them west, toward Cañon del Muerto. Lila had never ridden this far from the ranch. Her world had been defined by the fence line and the woodpile. But out here, under the vast, indifferent sky, she felt a terrifying expansion of her spirit. The fear of being caught was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was matched by the adrenaline of movement. "Keep close," Cade shouted over the roar of the wind. He pulled his mare up as the ground dropped away into a steep arroyo. "The weather is turning. A blue norther is coming." Lila looked up. The horizon to the north was a bruised wall of purple and black, advancing with unnatural speed. The temperature was plummeting. The dust that had been stinging her eyes was turning into stinging pellets of sleet. "We cannot make the canyon tonight," Cade yelled, his voice snatched away by the gale. "We need shelter. The horses will freeze if we stay in the open." He turned the mare toward a ridge of limestone that jutted out of the earth like the spine of a buried giant. Lila followed, her hands numb on the reins. The cold was a physical assault now, piercing through her wool coat as if it were made of lace. They found a hollow in the rock face, a shallow cave barely deep enough to keep the wind from flaying them. It was not much, but it was out of the direct line of the storm. Cade dismounted with fluid grace. Despite the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, he helped Lila down. Her legs were stiff, her knees buckling as her boots hit the hard stone. He caught her. For a second, she was pressed against the rough wool of his shirt, smelling the rain, the horse sweat, and the underlying scent of pine smoke that seemed to cling to him. His hands were steady on her arms. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I can walk," Lila said, though her teeth were chattering so hard the words came out fractured. They led the horses into the widest part of the overhang, using their bodies to block the wind while they unsaddled them. Cade worked efficiently, using a rough blanket to rub down the animals, preserving their heat. Then he turned his attention to Lila. "Sit," he commanded gently, pointing to the back of the alcove where the rock was dry. He gathered dried tumbleweeds and a few twisted branches of mesquite he had scavenged from the crevices. With his back to the wind, he struck a spark with flint and steel. It took time. Agonizing minutes where the cold seemed to seep into Lila's marrow. But finally, a small flame caught. The fire was meager, a flickering orange heart in the gray twilight. But it was enough. They sat close to it, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in the 2 saddle blankets. The space was intimate, enforced by the brutality of the elements. Outside, the world was ending in a scream of wind and ice. But inside the small circle of light, there was a quiet that felt heavy and electric. Lila held her hands out to the flame. They were red and raw. Cade reached out and took them on his own. His hands were calloused, the skin rough, but they were warm. He rubbed her knuckles, bringing the blood back to the surface. "You ride well for a cook," he said. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I grew up on a wagon seat," Lila replied, her voice low. "My father was a mover. He never stayed in one place long enough for the dust to settle. I learned to handle a team before I learned to read." "A mover," Cade repeated. He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that made the breath catch in her throat. "That is why you know the song." Lila nodded. "My mother. She learned it from a woman she met near the Red River. Years ago. A woman who was trading beadwork for flour. My mother said the tune was the only thing that stopped me from crying when the fever took me as a baby." Cade was silent for a long time. He turned Lila's hand over, tracing the lines of her palm with his thumb. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt of heat through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "That song," he said softly, "belonged to my grandmother's sister. She was lost in the fighting at Adobe Walls 10 years ago. We thought the song died with her. To hear it in a kitchen, from a woman with hair like winter wheat. It is a ghost returning." "It is not a ghost," Lila whispered. She looked up at him, her blue eyes meeting his dark ones. "It is just a memory, a piece of something beautiful that survived when everything else was broken." The distance between them vanished. In the cramped space, with the firelight dancing on the stone walls, the social laws of the territory, the laws that said a white woman and a Comanche man were natural enemies, dissolved. There was only the heat of their bodies, the shared rhythm of their breathing. Lila felt a sudden, fierce desire to be known, not as a servant, not as a suspect, but as herself. She leaned in, just an inch. Cade met her, his gaze dropping to her mouth. The air between them crackled. It was a dangerous, heady thing. This proximity, it was the thrill of the forbidden, but deeper than that. It was the recognition of a shared solitude. He lifted a hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered on her jawline. Lila closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. It was a gesture of such tenderness that it made her chest ache. "You are shaking," he murmured. "I am not cold," she answered. He did not kiss her, not then. Instead, he pulled the blanket tighter around them both, tucking the edge under her chin. He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her solid against his side. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady thud of his heart. It was a heavy, strong beat, a drum in the darkness. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow we will find the canyon. Tomorrow we will fight. Tonight, we will just stay warm." Lila fell asleep to the sound of the wind and the feeling of his breath stirring her hair. For the first time in her life, she did not dream of running away. She dreamed of standing still. The morning brought a world scoured clean. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a brilliant, hard blue and the ground dusted with frost. They rode out at dawn, the air crisp enough to snap in the lungs. They reached Canyon del Muerto by mid-morning. It was a slash in the earth, a deep, red-walled gorge hidden from the main trails. Cade led the way, reading the ground like a newspaper. "Here," he said, pointing to a patch of scrub oak near the canyon floor. "Wagon tracks, heavy ones. The rain washed most of it, but the ruts are deep." They dismounted and proceeded on foot, climbing up a narrow deer trail to a series of shallow caves halfway up the canyon wall. Cade moved with his pistol drawn, silent as smoke. Lila followed, clutching the handle of the knife she had taken from the kitchen. The main cave was blocked by a pile of brush, artificially arranged. Cade pulled it aside. Inside, stacked almost to the ceiling, were crates. Government stamps were burned into the wood. Indian Agency. Fort Sill. Lila gasped. It is all here. The flour. The blankets. Cade pried open a crate with his knife. Inside were repeating rifles. Winchester 73s. Brand new. Gleaming in the dim light. Not just blankets, Cade said, his voice hard with anger. Guns. They were selling guns to the renegades across the border, or maybe to the cartels in Mexico. And blaming my people for stealing food, he moved to a small table set up in the back of the cave. On it lay a stack of papers. He shuffled through them, his face grim. Here, he said, handing a paper to Lila. It was a bill of sale. Received from H. Pike, 40 crates of hardware, signed, Silas Crow, and below it, a countersignature verifying the inventory count. In a shaky, bureaucratic hand, Agent E. Barker. And look at this, Lila said, picking up an object from the table. It was a leather-bound tally book, stamped with the Rattlesnake Creek Ranch brand. Pike left his own tally book. He is so arrogant he did not even think to destroy the evidence of his own inventory moving off the ranch. We have them, Cade said. The ledger from the office, the bill of sale, the guns. We have everything. We have to take this back, Lila said. We have to show someone. The Jubilee, Cade said. Tomorrow is the town Jubilee. The judge will be there, the marshal, the whole town. If we walk in there with this, in front of 500 people, Pike cannot kill us. He cannot bury it. Then we ride, Lila said. But the ride back was not the ride of the hunters. It was the ride of the hunted. They pushed the horses hard, circling wide to avoid the main roads. They needed to get close to the ranch, to the cook shack, to regroup and clean up before making the journey into town. They couldn't walk into the Jubilee looking like fugitives. They needed to look like witnesses. They arrived at the outskirts of the ranch well after dark. Cade tethered the horses in a thicket of mesquite a mile out. They moved in on foot, using the drainage ditches for cover. The cook shack was dark. Lila felt a pang of relief. If they could just get inside, she could wash the dust from her face, put on her Sunday dress, and hide the evidence in the flour bin until morning. Wait, Cade whispered, his hand clamping on her arm. He was staring at the main house. Too many lights, but Lila was already moving toward the back door of the shack. I need my shawl, she whispered back. And the money jar. We might need to buy passage after this. She reached the door. She lifted the latch, the one Cade had fixed so perfectly. She stepped inside. The darkness of the kitchen was not empty. A match flared. Lila froze. Sitting at her work table, illuminated by the sudden yellow glow of a lantern, was Harlan Pike. Behind him stood Silas Crow, cleaning his fingernails with a Bowie knife, and in the corner, weeping into her apron, was June. Welcome home, Miss Hart, Pike said. His voice was calm, terrifyingly so. June tells us you have been sleepwalking, riding, actually. Lila turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her. 2 ranch hands stepped out from the pantry, grabbing her arms. We found the horse, Crow said, standing up. Rode hard, put up wet, shameful way to treat livestock. Where is he? Pike asked, leaning forward. Where is the savage? Lila struggled, but the hands held her fast. I was alone, she spat. I took the horse to clear my head. Pike laughed, a dry, barking sound. To clear your head. With my private ledger, we checked the office. Lila, we know it is gone. And we know you didn't pick that lock yourself. He stood up and walked over to her. He backhanded her across the face. It was a heavy, stinging blow that tasted of copper. You are going to tell us where he is and where my book is, Pike said softly. Or, mister, Crow is going to show you why he is the best in the business. Outside, in the shadows of the woodpile, Cade watched. His hand gripped the handle of his knife until his knuckles turned white. He could leave. He had the evidence in the saddlebags a mile away. He could ride to the reservation, present the proof to the tribal council. and perhaps clear his name that way. He could survive. That was the way of the scout survival above all else. To enter that room was death. There were 4 men in there, armed. But then he heard Lila's voice through the thin walls. She was not crying. She was shouting. "He is worth 10 of you. He is a man of honor, and you are just thieves." Cade closed his eyes. He thought of the wind in the canyon. He thought of the warmth of her hand in his. He thought of the definition of freedom he had spoken of in the cave. Freedom is not doing what you want. It is paying the price to be who you are. He was not a man who left his ally to burn. He moved, not away from the danger, but toward it, inside. Crow was stepping closer to Lila with a heated poker from the stove. "Sing for me, little bird," he sneered. The window where they had first met, exploded inward. Glass shattered, spraying across the room. A figure flew through the frame, rolling over the work table in a shower of flour and shards. Cade hit the ground and came up spinning. He kicked the lantern off the table, plunging the room into chaotic semi-darkness, lit only by the red glow of the stove's open door. "Run!" he shouted to Lila. He threw a handful of something into the air-dried chili powder he had grabbed from the hanging strings near the window. It filled the air with a choking, blinding dust. The men coughed and cursed, firing their pistols blindly. Lila bit the hand of the man holding her. He yelped and let go. She didn't run for the door. She ran for Cade. He grabbed her hand. "The root cellar," he commanded. They dove toward the pantry floor, where the trap door to the root cellar lay. Cade kicked it open, and they tumbled down into the darkness just as a bullet splintered the wood where their heads had been. They landed on a pile of potato sacks. Cade was up instantly, shoving a heavy barrel under the trap door to wedge it shut. Above them, boots stomped and men shouted. "There is a drain," Lila gasped, coughing from the chili dust. "An old drainage pipe that leads to the creek bed. It is small, but we can fit in." "Lead the way," Cade said. He was breathing hard. And Lila saw a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. A graze, or worse. "You came back," she whispered, touching his arm. "I could not find the path without the song," he said simply. They crawled through the mud and slime of the drainage pipe, emerging hundreds of yards away in the creek bed, gasping for the clean, cold air. The ranch was in an uproar behind them, torches flaring to life. "They will expect us to run for the reservation," Cade said, tying a strip of his shirt around his bleeding arm. "North. We go to town," Lila said, her eyes hard. "We go to the Jubilee. We will finish this." "It is a trap," Cade warned. "Crow will be there." "Let him come," Lila said. She reached into her bodice and pulled out the folded bill of sale she had hidden against her skin. "I am done cooking for men who want to kill me. Tomorrow, I will serve them something they cannot swallow." They moved into the night, heading south toward the lights of Tascosa, leaving the ranch behind forever. The kitchen, once Lila's whole world, was now just a distant spark in the dark, a staging ground for the war that would start at dawn. The town of Tascosa had gathered in the square, a dusty expanse of trampled earth bordered by the saloon, the mercantile, and the whitewashed siding of the church. It was the Jubilee, a celebration meant to mark the end of the harvest and the resilience of the settlers. But on this day, the air did not smell of roasted corn and apple cider. It smelled of sweat, cheap whiskey, and a tension so thick it could be cut with a skinning knife. Harlan Pike stood on the raised wooden platform that had been erected for the band. He was a large man, and in his fine black coat and silk vest, he looked like a king addressing his subjects. Beside him stood Agent Barker, a thin man who kept wiping his forehead with a handkerchief despite the biting chill of the autumn wind. "We are a people under siege," Pike bellowed, his voice booming across the crowd of 500 souls. "We work this land. We bleed for this land. And yet, the government in Washington expects us to feed the very savages who steal our cattle and threaten our wives." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. Men raised their fists. Women nodded grimly. The fear that had been cultivated by rumors and planted evidence had ripened into a harvest of hate. The annuity was stolen, Pike continued, gesturing to the open plain beyond the town. Stolen by the Comanche. And I say, if the army will not protect us, we must protect ourselves. I say we ride at dawn. Ride, the crowd chanted. Ride. Lila Hart stood at the back of the square. She wore her best dress, the dark blue calico she usually saved for Easter, but the hem was stained with mud from the creek bed and her hair was windblown. She felt small against the wall of noise, a solitary figure against a tide of anger. But she felt the weight of the paper against her ribs, and she felt the memory of Cade's hand in hers. She pushed forward. She did not shove. She simply moved with a singular, terrifying purpose. People turned to look at her, surprised by the force emanating from the quiet woman they knew only as the cook from Rattlesnake Creek. She moved past the ranch hands who were drinking from flasks. She moved past the shopkeepers and the wives. She reached the steps of the platform. Mr. Pike. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through a lull in the cheering like a dropped plate. Pike looked down, annoyed. When he recognized her, his eyes narrowed into slits. Go home, Lila. This is men's business. You are distraught. I am not distraught, Lila said, climbing the first step. And I'm not going home, because I know where the annuity went. The crowd quieted. Gossip traveled faster than telegraph wires in Tascosa, and everyone knew Lila Hart was the one who had disappeared the night before. She is confused, Pike shouted to the crowd, forcing a smile. The poor woman has been working too hard. Someone get the doctor. I saw the wagons, Lila said, her voice rising, gaining strength from the sheer audacity of the truth. She climbed onto the platform. She looked out at the sea of faces, people she had fed, people she had feared, people who had ignored her. They did not go north to the reservation. They went west, to Cañon del Muerto. Liar. Silas Crow stepped out from behind the group of dignitaries. His hand hovered near his gun. She is covering for her lover, the savage. Lila did not flinch. She reached into her bodice and pulled out the folded paper. She held it up, the wind snapping the edges. This is a bill of sale, she announced, turning the paper so the crowd could see the dark ink, even if they could not read the words from a distance. It lists 40 crates of repeating rifles. It lists 300 blankets. And it is signed by Silas Crow and countersigned by Agent Barker. Barker went pale, dropping his handkerchief. She stole that. Pike roared, losing his composure. She broke into my private office. She is a thief. Why would a bill of sale for stolen government property be in your office, Mr. Pike? Lila asked. She turned to the crowd. He sold the annuity supplies. He sold them to gun runners across the border. And he paid Crow to kill the driver and plant the arrows to blame the Comanche. He wants a war so he can claim the water rights on the reservation land once the tribes are gone. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was a complicated accusation, but the paper in her hand was a physical anchor for the truth. Arrest her, Pike screamed to the marshal, who stood uncertainly by the stairs. She is hysterical. She is lying. I am not the only witness, Lila said. From the shadow of the livery stable across the square, a horseman rode out. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the square. It was a Comanche. He rode a roan mare, his head high, his buckskin shirt stained with dried blood at the shoulder. He did not have a weapon in his hand. He rode slowly, deliberately, into the heart of the town that wanted him dead. Cade stopped his horse at the base of the platform. He looked at the crowd, his dark eyes scanning the faces of the men who had hunted him. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a man who was tired of running. I am Cade, he said. His voice carried that strange, rhythmic cadence, calm amidst the storm. I am a scout for the Antelope Band. My people are starving. We did not take the wagons. I saw this man. He pointed a long finger at Crow. Bury the driver. I saw him take the gold. The visual was powerful. The cook and the warrior, standing together against the richest man in the territory. The crowd wavered. Doubt began to erode their anger. Silas Crow saw the shift. He saw the marshal's hand move toward his badge, not his gun. He saw Barker trembling. The narrative was collapsing. Crow drew his revolver, not at Cade, but at the sky. He fired 3 shots. "Look!" Crow shouted, pointing toward the south. "Look at the ranch." Heads turned. In the distance, rising like a black pillar against the blue sky, was a plume of thick, dark smoke. "The savages are attacking!" Crow yelled, improvising his lie with desperate ferocity. "While he distracts you here, his war party is burning Rattlesnake Creek. They are burning your homes." It was a brilliant, evil stroke. Panic, primal and immediate. Seize the crowd. "Fire!" someone screamed. "Save the ranch!" Lila looked at the smoke. Her heart stopped. That was not the main house. The smoke was coming from the back, from the detached structures. "The kitchen?" she whispered. "It is a trick," Cade said, looking at Crow. He signaled his men, but the mob did not care about logic. They surged forward, a chaotic river of bodies rushing toward horses and wagons. In the confusion, Crow jumped from the platform, disappearing into the mass of people. Pike grabbed Barker by the arm and dragged him toward a carriage. "My book!" Lila cried, realizing her mistake. She had left the recipe book, the book with the bone disc hidden in its spine, in the kitchen. It was the only piece of her mother she had left. It was the only proof of the bond she and Cade had formed before the words were spoken. "Lila, no!" Cade shouted as she ran down the steps. "They are burning it!" she screamed. She didn't wait. She grabbed the reins of a loose horse, hitched her skirt, and scrambled into the saddle. She kicked the horse into a gallop, riding not away from the danger, but straight toward the column of smoke. Cade cursed in his own tongue. He spurred the roan mare, chasing after her. The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare of dust and wind. The fire had started in the dry grass behind the cook shack and, fed by the fierce wind, had leapt to the structure itself. By the time Lila rode into the yard, the kitchen, her prison and her sanctuary, was a box of orange flame. The heat was physical, a wall that pushed her back. The roar of the fire drowned out the wind. "My book," Lila sobbed. She slid from the horse. She ran toward the door. The heat singed her eyebrows. The wood of the door frame was groaning. "Lila, stop!" Cade's voice was behind her. She didn't stop. She kicked the door open. Inside, the smoke was a blinding, choking gray curtain. She dropped to her knees, crawling toward the shelf. The air was hot enough to blister skin. She felt her way along the wall. The jar of money was shattered. The flour bin was burning. She found the shelf. Her fingers closed around the spine of the book. Crack. A beam from the ceiling, eaten through by the fire, gave way. It crashed down across the doorway, bringing a shower of sparks and burning shingles. Lila turned to run, but the way was blocked. She was trapped in the oven she had tended for 10 years. She coughed, the smoke filling her lungs. She curled around the book, pulling her skirt up to cover her face. "This is how it ends," she thought, not with a song, but with silence. Then, a shape moved through the wall of fire. Cade did not hesitate. He had wrapped his wool blanket around his head and shoulders. He vaulted over the burning beam. Landing in the inferno, he found her by instinct, by the pull of the river song that still echoed between them. He grabbed her waist. "Up!" he roared, his voice raw. He didn't try to go back through the door. He threw a heavy cast-iron skillet through the side window, the window where he had first seen her humming. The glass shattered. He kicked the remaining frame out. He lifted her, shoving her through the opening. Hands grabbed her from the outside miller and the marshal, who had ridden hard behind them. They pulled her onto the dirt, coughing and retching. Cade dove out after her, rolling in the dust, his blanket smoking. Lila lay on the ground, gasping for air. She clutched the book to her chest. She looked up. The kitchen collapsed inward with a sound like a dying beast, sending a funnel of sparks into the heavens. She was alive, but the silence was short-lived. "You should have burned it, boy." Silas Crow stepped out from behind the smokehouse. He was covered in soot, his eyes manic. He held a Bowie knife in one hand and a heavy revolver in the other. He had ridden ahead of the mob, intent on finishing what he started. Cade stood up. He tossed the smoking blanket aside. He was weaponless. His knife had been lost in the crawl through the drain the night before. He stood with his hands open, his chest heaving. "No more lies. Crow," Cade said. "The fire cleans everything." Crow laughed. "The fire cleans nothing. It just leaves ash." He raised the gun, but he didn't fire. He holstered it slowly, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He wanted to do this with his hands. He wanted to break the man who had humiliated him. He threw the gun into the dust. He transferred the knife to his right hand. "Come on, savage. Let us see what you are made of." The fight was not a dance. It was a collision. Crow lunged, the knife flashing. Cade sidestepped, but not fast enough. The blade sliced across his ribs. Cade grunted. Grabbing Crow's wrist, they slammed into the side of the burning barn. It was ugly. It was dust and blood and the sound of fists hitting meat. Crow was heavier, stronger, fueled by rage. He drove a knee into Cade's stomach. Cade went down. Crow was on top of him instantly, the knife descending. Lila screamed. She scrambled up, looking for a weapon. A rock. Anything. Cade caught Crow's wrist with both hands. The tip of the blade hovered inches from his eye. The heat from the fire beat against them. Cade's strength was failing. He was starving, wounded, exhausted. Crow grinned, his teeth white in his soot-blackened face. "Die." Cade looked at Lila. He didn't look at the knife. He looked at her. And in that moment, he found a reserve of strength that did not come from muscle. It came from the refusal to let the song end. He twisted his hips, bucking Crow off balance. He let go of the wrist and slammed the palm of his hand upward, catching Crow under the chin. It was a strike meant to stun. Crow's head snapped back. Cade rolled, scrambling for the knife that Crow had dropped. They both lunged for it. "Hold it!" The shout was like a whip crack. Crow froze, his hand inches from the knife handle. He looked up. Standing 10 feet away was the marshal, and beside him stood Miller, the ranch hand who had once mocked Lila. Miller held a Winchester rifle, and it was aimed squarely at Crow's chest. "Touch that knife, Crow, and I will put a hole in you the size of a dinner plate," Miller said. His voice was shaking, but the gun was steady. Crow looked around. The mob had arrived, but they weren't attacking. They were watching. They had seen the rescue. They had seen the cook and the Comanche come out of the fire together, and now they saw the hired killer trying to murder an unarmed man. "He started the fire," a woman in the crowd said, pointing at Crow. "I saw him ride past with a torch. And the annuity," another voice shouted. Lila told the truth. The illusion of Pike's power shattered. Pike, seeing the tide turn, tried to slip away toward the corral where his carriage was waiting. He moved quietly, hoping the spectacle of the fight would cover his escape. "Mr. Pike," Lila's voice rang out. She stood up, still clutching her book. She pointed at him. "You are forgetting something." She reached into the spine of the book she had risked her life to save, and pulled out the bone disc. But as she did, something else fell out. A folded piece of paper she had tucked there days ago without thinking, a shipping manifest she had found in the trash, listing special cargo for Pike. But she didn't need the paper. She walked toward Pike. "The ledger," she said. "The one you thought you burned in the kitchen. You didn't know I gave it to Dr. Miles's wife for safekeeping before I went to the platform. It was a bluff, a magnificent, desperate bluff. The ledger was likely ash in the bottom of the kitchen, but Pike didn't know that." Pike's face crumbled. He looked at the marshal. He looked at the angry faces of the townspeople who realized they had been played for fools. "It was Barker," Pike squealed, pointing a trembling finger at the agent. "It was his idea. He forged the signatures." "And you cashed the checks," the marshal said, stepping forward with handcuffs. Agent Barker, sobbing, fell to his knees. "He made me do it. He threatened my family." The chaos of the Jubilee had been replaced by the cold, hard machinery of justice. The marshal handcuffed Crow, who spat on the ground, his eyes dead and cold. Then he cuffed Pike. Lila stood in the center of the yard, The adrenaline was fading, leaving her trembling. Her face was smeared with soot. Her dress was ruined. Her kitchen, her home, was a pile of glowing embers. She turned to Cade. He was leaning against the water trough, holding his side. He was battered, bleeding, and covered in dust, but he was smiling. He walked over to her. He did not care about the crowd. He did not care about the marshal. He reached out and took her hand, the hand that was clutching the scorched recipe book. "You went back for the book," he said softly. "It has good recipes." Lila whispered, her voice cracking. "And a secret." She opened her hand to show him the bone disc. It was warm from the fire, but unharmed. "The fire took the kitchen," Cade said, looking at the ruins. "But it left the cook." "I am not a cook anymore," Lila said. She looked at the crowd, at the people who were now looking at her with awe instead of disdain. She had lost her shelter, but she had found her voice. Cade squeezed her hand. "No, you are the woman who speaks to the wind." The wind gusted then, swirling the ash into the air, carrying the heat away into the vast, open sky of the Panhandle. It was a cold wind, but for the first time in her life, Lila Hart did not feel the chill. She stood amidst the wreckage of her old life, holding the hand of the man who had helped her burn it down, ready to build something new. The dust from the Jubilee did not settle in a day. It hung over Tascosa and the Rattlesnake Creek Ranch for weeks, a persistent haze that smelled of scorched timber and shattered reputations. The arrest of Harlan Pike and Agent Barker was not the swift, clean justice of a dime novel. It was a messy, bureaucratic affair involving a circuit judge who arrived 3 days later, grumpy from the saddle sores and demanding a bottle of good whiskey before he would hear a single word of testimony. The town itself did not undergo a miraculous conversion. The men who had shouted for blood in the square did not suddenly become enlightened scholars of tolerance. They were still hard men living in a hard land, driven by fear and the vagaries of the cattle market. However, the fever had broken. Without the poison of Pike's manufactured rumors, and with the undeniable evidence of the stolen rifles sitting in the marshal's office, the mob lost its teeth. They went back to their plows and their herds, muttering about how they had suspected something was wrong all along. A collective amnesia that allowed them to live with themselves. For Lila Hart, the aftermath was a trial of a different sort. She was no longer the invisible cook. She was a public figure, a woman who had dared to stand on a platform and shout down the wealthiest man in the county. She spent long hours in the back room of the marshal's office, giving her statement. The questions were often sharp, probing into her history, her morals, and her relationship with the Comanche scout. "You say you rode with him alone for 2 nights. Miss Hart, the prosecutor, a man with a wax-tipped mustache, asked with a sneer, "And we are to believe that your virtue remained intact in the wilderness." Lila sat straight in the hard wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap. She looked him in the eye. "My virtue is not on trial, sir. Mr. Pike's theft is, but since you ask, Cade treated me with more respect in a cave during a blizzard than most men in this town treat their wives in their own parlors." A few of the laborers at the back of the room, men with calloused hands and dusted coats, murmured their approval. They had begun to look at Lila differently. She was not just a servant anymore. She was the one who had pulled the curtain back on the corruption that kept them poor while Pike became rich. When she walked down the boardwalk, the banker's wife might have crossed the street to avoid her. But the blacksmith tipped his hat, and the teamsters nodded with genuine respect. Back at the ranch, the atmosphere was somber but industrious. The main house was locked up, seized by the bank until Pike's debts and legal fees were settled. But life had to go on. The cattle still needed feeding, and the horses needed tending. The blackened scar where the cook shack had stood was a wound in the earth. Lila stood before it on a Tuesday morning, the wind whipping her skirts. It smelled of wet ash and loss. That kitchen had been her prison, yes, but it had also been her home. "I reckon we should clear this mess before the snow flies," a voice said behind her. Lila turned. It was Miller, the ranch hand who had once made jokes about her humming. He held a shovel in one hand and a wheelbarrow handle in the other. Behind him were two other hands, looking sheepish. "Mister, Pike is not here to pay you for this," Lila said quietly. Miller shrugged, kicking a clod of dirt with his boot. "Pike never paid us for half the work we did anyway. Besides, a woman shouldn't have to haul ash alone, not after what you did." He didn't apologize. Men like Miller didn't know how to apologize with words. They did it with sweat. They started working, heaving the charred beams and shoveling the debris into the barrow. June came out of the laundry shed a moment later. She carried a bucket of cold water and a ladle. She walked up to Lila, her eyes red-rimmed and lowered. She didn't say a word about the ghost stories she had spread or the gossip she had fueled. She simply held out the ladle. "You look thirsty, Lila," June said, her voice small. Lila took the water. She drank, the cold liquid soothing her throat. She handed the ladle back. "Thank you. June, the boys will need some too." It was a small bridge, built over a river of regret. It was enough. Cade did not stay at the ranch. It was not safe, even with the truth out. A Comanche warrior sleeping in the bunkhouse would have invited violence. He camped by the creek, in the shelter of the cottonwoods, invisible to everyone except those who knew where to look. But the situation was untenable. The marshal rode out to the creek on the fourth day, accompanied by Dr. Miles. Lila was there, bringing a basket of bread and dried beef to Cade. The marshal stayed on his horse, his hand resting casually on his saddle horn. He looked down at Cade, who was cleaning his rifle with a small fire. "The judge is wrapping up the paperwork," the marshal said. "Pike is going to prison in Huntsville. Barker, too. The charges against you loitering, disturbing the peace, theft of livestock, they have been dropped. I convinced the judge that borrowing a horse to stop a felony isn't stealing." Cade nodded once. "And the annuity. The Army is recovering the rifles from the canyon. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is sending a new agent. Your people will get their supplies, or at least the money for them. It is not perfect, but it is legal." "Legal is good," Cade said. "Justice is better." The marshal sighed, shifting his weight. "Here is the hard truth. Son, you are a hero to some folks right now because you saved the cook and stopped the fire. But memory is short in the Panhandle. In a month, you will just be an Indian with a gun again. There are men in town, friends of Crow, friends of Pike, who are angry. They have long memories." Lila stepped forward, her hand tightening on the handle of her basket. "You are telling him to leave." "I am telling him that I cannot guarantee his safety if he stays," the marshal said, his voice not unkind. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded document with a wax seal. "This is a letter of exoneration, signed by me and the judge. It says you acted as an agent of the law. It will help you if you run into patrols on the way back to the reservation. But you need to go back to the reservation. Cade, at least for a while. Let the heat die down." Cade took the paper. He looked at it, then at Lila. His face was unreadable, the mask of the scout back in place. "I understand," Cade said. The marshal nodded, tipped his hat to Lila, and turned his horse back toward town. Dr. Miles lingered for a moment. "I checked your side yesterday, Cade," the doctor said. "The stitches are holding. Keep it clean. Don't ride too hard for another week." "Thank you, doctor," Cade said. When they were alone, the silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the water moving over the stones. "He is right," Lila said, her voice trembling slightly. "You cannot stay here. It is too dangerous." "And you?" Cade asked. "Will you run? You have the respect of the town now. You could get a job in Tascosa or take a stagecoach east." Lila looked back toward the ranch, where the skeleton of the burnt kitchen was finally being cleared away. She thought of the fear that had ruled her life for so long, the urge to disappear, to be small. That fear was gone, burned away in the fire. "I am done running," Lila said. "My mother died in a wagon, always moving, always looking for a place to rest. I want to stop." "There is nothing here but ash," Cade said. "Ash is good for the soil," Lila replied. She looked at him, a fierce determination in her eyes. "Mrs. Leary, The head housekeeper. She has a little money saved. And Pike's assets are frozen, but the ranch is still on a major trail. Travelers still need to eat. The hands still need biscuits. You are going to rebuild, Cade stated. Not the ranch kitchen, Lila said. Something else. Something of my own. Mrs. Leary and I, we talked. We are going to build a roadhouse, a place for decent food, a place where the door is not locked against the wind. Cade looked at her with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. He knew what she was saying. She was planting roots, and he was a man of the wind. I will help you clear the ground, he said. Before I go, the rebuilding was not the work of a day, but the work of weeks. With Pike gone, the ranch was in limbo, managed by the bank, but the land remained. Lila and Mrs. Leary, a formidable woman with iron-gray hair and a heart hidden under layers of starch, staked their claim on the plot of land where the cook shack had stood. They used the timber from an old collapsed barn for the frame. Miller and the other hands helped in their off hours, accepting payment in fresh pies and hot coffee. Cade worked with them. He did not say much, and the white men gave him a wide berth at first, but labor is a universal language. When a beam needed lifting, Cade was there. When a joint needed to be fitted, his knife worked the wood with a precision that shamed the carpenters. Slowly, the tension eased. Miller even offered Cade a plug of tobacco one afternoon, a gesture of peace as significant as a treaty. The new structure was simple. It was not a dark shack hidden behind the main house. It faced the road. It had wide windows to let in the light. It had a porch where a person could stomp the mud off their boots. On the final day before Cade had to leave, the roof was finished. The smell of raw pine and sawdust filled the air, a clean, hopeful scent that replaced the memory of the fire. It was late afternoon. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet. The workers had gone. Mrs. Leary was in the main house, negotiating with the bank agent for supplies. Lila and Cade stood inside the unfinished shell of the building. The floor was swept clean. In the center, a new stove smaller than the dragon of the old kitchen, but sturdy, sat waiting to be lit. Lila ran her hand along the rough wood of the window frame. It is good work, she said. It will stand against the wind, Cade said. He was standing near the door, his hat in his hands. The inevitable moment had arrived. His horse was saddled by the creek. I have a name for it, Lila said. She reached behind the stove and pulled out a piece of polished oak board. She had carved it herself, late at night, by candlelight. She turned it over. Deeply etched into the wood were the words, "The Quiet Stove." Cade traced the letters with his eye. It is a good name, a place to listen. A place where no one has to sing alone, Lila added softly. She set the sign down and walked over to him. The space between them felt charged, heavy with the things they could not say. They lived in a world that had no place for them together, not yet. A white woman and a Comanche man could not set up a house in the Texas Panhandle in 1872 without inviting a war they could not win. They both knew this. It was the cruel, pragmatic math of the frontier, but the heart has its own arithmetic. Cade reached out and took her hand. His thumb brushed the pulse point at her wrist. His skin was rough, scarred from the fight with Crow, warm and alive. I must go to the winter camp, he said. My people will need to know the truth about the rifles. I must help them prepare for the cold. I know, Lila whispered. She did not cry. Tears were for children who thought the world was fair. Lila knew better. But the winter does not last forever, Cade said. He stepped closer. The scent of pine and sage enveloped her. And a scout always returns to the places where he found water. He lifted his hand to her face, cupping her cheek. His eyes searched hers, memorizing the blue of them, the line of her jaw, the strength he had found there. Lila leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. She felt his breath on her face. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, adrenaline-fueled collision of the cave. It was slow. It was deliberate. It tasted of the journey they had taken, the fear, the fire, the silence, and the understanding. It was a kiss of promise, a seal on a contract written in blood and ash. It lasted for a long, suspended moment, a lifetime in a heartbeat. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against hers. "Wait for the thaw," he whispered. "I will keep the coffee hot," she replied. He stepped back, his hand lingering on hers until the last possible second. Then he turned and walked out the door. Lila did not follow him to the horse. She could not bear to watch him ride away. She stood in the center of her new kitchen, listening. She heard the creak of leather, the jingle of the bit, and the rhythm of hooves moving away, fading into the vastness of the prairie. She stood there until the silence returned. But it was not the empty, terrifying silence of before. It was a peaceful silence, a silence waiting to be filled. She walked to the new stove. She opened the firebox and arranged the kindling strips of cedar and dry oak. She struck a match on the sole of her boot. The flame flared to life, bright and steady. She lit the fire. The wood crackled, the sound echoing off the new walls. It was the heartbeat of the quiet stove. Outside, the sun slipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared. But Lila was not afraid of the dark anymore. She had a fire, she had a name, and she knew that out there in the wind, someone was listening to her song. 1 year had passed since the fire, and the seasons had turned their slow, heavy wheel across the panhandle. The autumn of 1873 brought the same biting wind and the same endless expanse of brown grass. But at the bend of the creek where the blackened ruins of the old cook shack had once stood, something new had taken root. The quiet stove was not a grand establishment. It was a long, low building made of honey-colored pine that had begun to silver in the weather. It had a wide porch that wrapped around the front, shielded from the north wind, and a chimney that puffed white smoke into the blue sky like a welcoming flag. Inside, the air was always thick with the scent of roasted coffee, rosemary, and yeast. It was a smell that promised safety. On a Tuesday afternoon, the main room was occupied by a tableau that would have been impossible a year prior. At one table, 2 ranch hands from the Circle J were eating beef stew, their hats resting on their knees. At another table near the window, a family of settlers moving west sat with their travel-dusty children, sharing a loaf of fresh bread, and near the hearth, standing quietly with a cup of coffee in his hand, was a Comanche trader named Ten Bears, who had stopped to exchange cured deer hides for a sack of cornmeal. There was no shouting. There were no guns drawn. The air was tentative. Yes. The ranch hands cast wary glances at the trader, and the trader watched the door with the instinct of a man in enemy territory. But there was peace. It was a small, fragile peace, held together by the smell of good food and the presence of the woman who moved between the tables. Lila Hart was 25 now. She wore a dress of sturdy blue wool, not the gray of a servant. Her apron was white and crisp. She moved with a new authority. She was no longer trying to be invisible. When she poured coffee for the ranch hands, she looked them in the eye. When she traded with Ten Bears, she spoke the few words of Comanche she had learned with a clumsy but sincere effort that made the old man's eyes crinkle with amusement. And she hummed. It was not the fearful, hidden sound of the old days. It was a rich, low melody that wove through the clatter of silverware and the murmur of conversation. She hummed as she kneaded dough. She hummed as she wiped down the counter. She hummed because she was alive, and because the sound was proof that she occupied space in the world. "Miss Lila," one of the ranch hands called out, raising his hand. "This stew, it is the best thing I have eaten since I left Kentucky." Lila smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Evans. The secret is in the sage, and let it simmer until it learns patience." She walked back to the kitchen. The heart of the establishment, Mrs. Leary, was there, peeling potatoes with the ruthless efficiency of a machine. The older woman had softened only slightly, but her loyalty to Lila was as solid as the iron stove. Post rider came by. Mrs. Leary said, nodding toward a small envelope on the work table. "Leave this for you." Lila wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the letter. The handwriting was cramped and hesitant. It was postmarked from a mission school near Fort Sill. Lila sat on a stool near the back door to read it. It was from a girl named Sarah, a name given to her by the teachers, though Lila knew her as Little Bird, the daughter of a Comanche woman who had passed through the quiet stove months ago. "Dear Miss Lila, the school is cold. The walls are stone. They tell us not to speak our tongue. They tell us our songs are noisy. The other day, I tried to hum the grinding song, and the matron laughed. She said only birds should sing without words. I feel small. What is the benefit of singing when people laugh? What is the benefit of humming when no one wants to hear Sarah?" Lila felt a pang in her chest. It was an echo of her own life, of the years she had spent shrinking herself to fit into the corners of a room. She took a pencil and a piece of paper from her ledger. She thought for a long moment, listening to the wind rattle the window pane. Then she wrote, "Dear Sarah, we do not sing for them. We do not sing to be heard by the ears of people who have forgotten how to listen. We sing to keep our own souls from drying up like the grass in August. When you hum, you are drawing a circle around yourself. Inside that circle, you are not a student, and you are not a servant. You are a memory of the people who came before you. You are the river and the wind. Let them laugh. Laughter is just wind, but a song is a root. It holds you to the earth. Sing to remind yourself that you are still there, your friend, Lila." She folded the letter and placed it in her pocket. She will give it to the postwriter tomorrow. It was not a lesson from a book. It was a lesson from the fire. The door to the kitchen opened. A gust of cold air swirled in, bringing with it the scent of ozone and horse sweat. Lila did not turn around immediately. She knew that scent. She felt the change in the air pressure, a sudden shift from the mundane to the electric. "The coffee is fresh," she said to the room. "I prefer water," a voice replied. From the deep well. Lila turned. Cade stood in the doorway. He looked older. The year had etched new lines around his eyes, and there was a scar on his cheek from a branch or a blade that hadn't been there before. He wore a heavy buffalo coat against the encroaching winter, and his hair was tied back with a leather thong. He did not look like a man who belonged indoors, yet he stepped into her kitchen with a quiet familiarity. He did not come often. To be a permanent fixture at the quiet stove would be to invite trouble for both of them. The town tolerated his presence because of the fire, because he had saved the cook, but prejudice was a sleeping dog that woke easily. So he came like the wind unannounced, brief and essential. "Cade," Lila said. The name tasted like honey. He closed the door, shutting out the cold. He walked over to the table and placed a bundle wrapped in oilcloth on the wood. "For the winter," he said. Lila opened it. Inside were cured furs, beaver and fox soft and perfectly tanned. They were worth a month's wages in town. And nestled among them was a small pouch of seeds. "Corn," he explained. "From the trade with the Pueblos in the west. It grows deep roots. Good for dry earth." "Thank you," Lila said. She touched the furs. They were still cool from the ride. "Are you hungry?" "I can eat," he said. She served him a plate of stew and a thick slice of bread. He ate standing up, leaning against the counter, watching her. He was always watching her, as if checking to make sure she was still real, that she hadn't dissolved into smoke like the kitchen they had escaped. "The town is quiet," Cade observed. "I rode past the square. No one looked twice at the roan." "They are busy," Lila said. "The new agent is actually distributing the flour this month, and the cattle prices are up. Men are less angry when their bellies are full." "And Crow?" Cade asked. It was the name that always hovered between them. "Still in Huntsville prison," Lila said. 10 years, the judge said. "He will be an old man when he gets out." "Time is a slow arrow," Cade said. He finished his meal and set the plate down. He reached into his belt and pulled out something else. It was a knife, but not a weapon. It was a kitchen knife, the handle carved from ironwood, the blade forged from high-quality steel. likely repurposed from a broken cavalry saber. It was balanced and sharp. The old one was dull, he said simply. Lila took the knife. She tested the weight of it. It fit her hand perfectly. It was a tool for creation, given by a man whose life was defined by destruction. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It is sharp," he corrected. "Beauty does not cut meat." He looked toward the main room, where the murmur of conversation continued. "You have built a good place." Lila Hart. "It is neutral ground." "It is a place to eat," Lila said. "Hunger is the one thing everyone has in common. It makes us equal." Cade nodded. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. The connection between them was not the fiery, desperate thing it had been in the cave. It had tempered, like steel. It was stronger now, less fragile. It was a love that understood the necessity of distance and the value of return. He reached out and touched her hand, the one holding the new knife. His fingers were rough, warm, and real. "I must go," he said. "The band is moving to the Winter Canyon. The snow is coming early this year." "Will you be safe?" Lila asked. It was the question she always asked, and the answer was always the silence of the plains. "I will be careful," he said. "That is better than safe." He turned to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. The light from the setting sun slanted through the window, catching the dust motes in the air, turning them into gold. Lila felt a sudden, sharp ache of longing. She wanted to ask him to stay. She wanted to lock the door and keep the world out. But she knew that a caged hawk dies, and a scout who stops moving ceases to be himself. Their love was defined by freedom, the freedom to choose, and the freedom to let go. "Cade," she said. He looked back. She didn't have words for what she felt, so she hummed. Just a few notes. The river song. The Puha song. It floated across the kitchen, soft and clear. A bridge made of air. Cade stood there for a long beat. The harsh lines of his face softened. He looked at her not as a lover he was leaving, but as a North Star he would navigate by. "If you keep singing," he said, his voice low and steady, "I can still find the way." He opened the door. The wind rushed in, smelling of frost and sage. It swirled around Lila's skirts and danced with the fire in the stove. Then he was gone. Lila did not run to the window this time. She did not need to see him right away to know he was out there. She closed the door firmly against the cold. She went back to her work table. She picked up the new knife. She began to chop vegetables for the evening soup. The rhythm of the blade against the wood was steady. Chop, chop, chop. And as she worked, she began to hum again. Louder this time. The sound filled the kitchen. It drifted out into the main room, where the cowboys and the settlers and the trader paused for a second to listen. It was not a lonely sound. It was the sound of a woman who was exactly where she chose to be. It was the sound of a quiet stove that kept the world warm. Outside, the wind carried the melody across the plains, weaving it into the grass and the stars. A promise that when the winter broke, the path would still be there. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Do not forget to like this video and smash that hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these legends alive. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open. Goodbye.